Hey everybody, how's it going? So today I want to talk about another airplane. In my other videos about airplanes, we usually look at more strange or unique designs, designs that really stood out, like the flying pancakes, the pusher prop planes, and this 12-engine monstrosity. Today though, we'll be looking at a pretty standard looking plane, an American one made before World War II that rather quickly became outdated and outclassed as the US progressed through the early stages of the war. However, oddly enough, this plane very well may have been a major reason why the US won at the Battle of Midway and consequently won the Pacific War. The plane in question for today is the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber. The Devastator originates from back in the mid-1930s out of a competition for new carrier-based bombers. The Devastator was one of the selected winners that would be ordered, alongside others like the Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bomber and the Northrop BT dive bomber. Taking its first flight in April 1935, the Devastator already achieved a little bit of history as being the first all-metal naval plane, the first with an enclosed cockpit, and the first with hydraulically folding wings. Powered by a single Pratt & Whitney R1830-64 twin Wasp engine, the Devastator could fly at a maximum of about 206 miles an hour. As it was a torpedo bomber, the typical main armament was a single Mark 13 torpedo, although this could be altered to hold more standard land-based bombs. It was also outfitted with a single forward-firing machine gun, chambered in either 30 or 50 caliber, and a rear-firing 30 caliber machine gun. Because several different contracts were selected alongside the Devastator, relatively few were made, at least when compared to other World War II aircraft, so just 130 Devastators, 129 for the Navy, and a single prototype were made. From a tactical perspective, a good torpedo bomber may be more beneficial than a good dive bomber when it comes to air-to-ship combat. Really, the major advantage of a torpedo bomber is where the attack strikes the enemy ship. A dive bomber, more often than not, will hit the top and maybe the upper side of the ship. Very damaging to the sailors and weaponry, absolutely. But with a torpedo, at the very minimum, you strike at the waterline or lower, blowing a hole in the hull and making the boat take on water, the exact opposite thing that it wants. Basically, torpedo bombers are hypothetically better at outright sinking ships than dive bombers. So, in theory, this would make the torpedo bomber the optimal aircraft for the Navy and would ideally mean that the Devastator would have a very bright future ahead of it. Now, before we progress into the Devastator's combat history and the events at Midway, we need to discuss its main weapon a bit more. The Mark 13 torpedo was a bit experimental when it first began its design process back in 1925, as it was the first American torpedo that was supposed to be explicitly launched from an aircraft. As a result of this kind of torpedo being a pretty new thing for the United States, early models of the Mark 13 were unreliable, to put it mildly. To start, it was initially believed that the best and most reliable way of firing the torpedo was for the pilot to fly slowly and close to sea level. The general idea was to fly slower than 115 miles an hour at the very least. Not only did this make the plane equipped with the Mark 13 a complete sitting duck to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns, this method may have actually been counterproductive, according to later tests that showed that this method caused the torpedo to sort of slap against the water, the impact of which could damage the internal components and destroy the torpedo. If that wasn't bad enough, if it launched too fast, aka at speeds above 175 miles an hour, testing into 1943 showed that a staggering 36% of torpedoes didn't even start after hitting the water, and just 31% ran acceptably. The rest of them either randomly went off target, sank, or just ran at the wrong depth. This test in 1943 was actually much better than a test in mid-1941, where out of 10 torpedoes launched, just a single one functioned properly. 4 of them would just outright sink, and the other 5 went off erratically in some fashion. It wasn't until later in the war, around 1944, that testing and modifications to the Mark 13 made them actually reliable quality weapons. This is all to say that when the Devastator was using its main armament early in the war, that armament was horribly flawed to begin with. This is why the fact that the Devastator, using the Mark 13 and now already an outdated and outclassed aircraft, saw pretty decent success early on is rather surprising. And sure, there were only 130 of them maximum, and by the time the war started, the military already considered them to be outdated, so new ones weren't being made, and just general attrition over the years reduced their number to about 100. But regardless, the remaining Devastators would see initial military success, taking out several Japanese troop transport ships, some lesser combat ships like destroyers and cruisers, and just some general goods transport ships. Nothing world-beating, to be sure, but considering their low numbers and general outdatedness in 1942, some pretty decent success. Then, in May 1942, the Devastator would massively overachieve during the Battle of the Coral Sea, in that attacks by Devastators, in conjunction with dauntless dive bombers, successfully destroyed the light carrier Shoho. There are also claims that Devastators hit the Japanese carrier Shokaku, but these claims are disputed, and so I can't really count it as a success for it. So, to quickly recap, this outclassed plane managed to take out several troop transports, small combat ships, and contributed to the destruction of a carrier. All this despite having a faulty main weapon. So faulty, in fact, that some of the hits scored by pilots resulted in no explosion at all, as the torpedoes simply didn't detonate sometimes. This reportedly happened at the Coral Sea as well, so the fact that they were as successful as they were, at this point, is very remarkable, to say the least. Which then brings us to the Battle of Midway, where the Devastator would play an indirectly important role in what would be its last time on the front lines of the war. On the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers present at Midway, the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown, there were a total of 41 Devastators and 39 in reserves elsewhere. After U.S. forces spotted the Japanese forces, Admiral Raymond Spruance made the rather odd decision to immediately strike the Japanese without actually planning and formulating a coordinated attack. In this initial panic strike, all 41 Devastators would take to the skies with little to no coordinated escort fighters or protection. The Devastators desperately needed escort fighter protection, and this was known as they had it during the Battle of the Coral Sea. So, when they approached the Japanese carriers going into their 100-mile-an-hour attack speed, they were sitting ducks for the Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft guns, which, as a reminder, the Japanese Zeros could fly over 300 miles an hour. To put it mildly, it was a complete disaster for the Devastators, and out of the 41 that took off, just 6 of them would return, scoring 0 hits. It is possible that they managed to hit, but the torpedo malfunctioned. Can't rule that out. But regardless, no hits and 35 out of 41 lost. And yet, despite on the surface just being target practice for Japanese Zeros, their presence had a much greater and probably unintended impact. In being target practice for the Zeros, their presence and failed attacks on Japanese carriers served as a major distraction. Their presence forced the Zeros to stay low with the Devastators, and it also forced the Japanese to stay on the defensive for the moment, keeping American carriers clean. With their attacks occupying the Zeros and forcing Japanese carriers to focus on evasive maneuvers, this gave America's dauntless dive bombers adequate time and cover to gather seemingly unnoticed above the Japanese carriers. When the dauntless bombers finally struck, 3 out of the 4 Japanese carriers present at Midway were fatally wounded. So, because of the distracting presence of the Devastators, the American forces were effectively able to win Midway in one wave of dive bomber strikes. In a completely indirect fashion, the Devastators were a major factor in the American victory at Midway. But because of their abject failure to land hits and survive at Midway, all of the remaining 39 Devastators were immediately withdrawn from frontline service. They were replaced by the Grumman TBF Avenger, which was also present at Midway but in much smaller numbers, and the Avenger was much faster and better armed. However, it was still armed with the Mark 13 torpedo, so this severely limited how effective it could be as a torpedo bomber until the issues with the Mark 13 were fixed. Even then, the Avenger wasn't all that great and was still heavily reliant on fighter protection. As for the Devastator, it would be relegated to being a reserve for the Atlantic Command, and it saw some use as a training plane. By the end of 1944, just a single Devastator was still in existence, which was the prototype design, and even that was scrapped before the end of the year. No original Devastators exist in any collections today, and the only barely surviving airframes currently reside at the bottom of the ocean. Some of the ocean-residing frames have been located, but unfortunately there appear to be no plans to try and retrieve them, meaning that the Devastator has sadly been relegated to being a forgotten piece of American history. And on that slightly sadder note, we'll go ahead and end for today. Thank you all for watching the video. Of course, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell a friend. Don't have a friend? Give them money. Pay them to be your friend, and then tell them. Everyone likes money, especially your new friends. If you have any ideas for things you want to see talked about, why not tell me down in the comments? So again, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya!